Father was out of work and they couldn't afford to keep that house. And so we moved back into Helen Street, where we lived in the upstairs rooms of my grandmother's house. And so we lived with our grandparents for, I think, 4 or 5 years during the worst part of the Depression. And those weren't bad days, they were good days. My cousins lived across the street. We played ball in the street. Everybody played ball in the street. The ball we would play with would be so beat up, we'd have to take yarn to hold it together. We'd stick rags in it sometime because you couldn't afford a new ball. And so tin can would be your bases, and you'd play there until the police kicked you off, and then they leave, you go play it again. There weren't any cars to speak of on the streets anyway. So in our age, money controlled us and limited us in what we can do. I couldn't buy a bike. I peddled papers, and then I could make enough money, so I had to walk around my route. And after doing that a while, I could buy a used bike. My father was out of work. 10 cents was a huge sum of money. I remember once a young man came to our house to sell a magazine for 10 cents, and he was crying because he couldn't go home until he sold it. And my father had to tell him, we did not have 10 cents in the house. We couldn't buy that because we didn't have a dime. My grandfather, on that side of the family that we lived with, was a huckster. And he would go down to the city market every morning, and he would buy fruits and vegetables, and then he would drive through the city into town where his route was, so to speak, and he would stand in the street, in the middle of the street, he'd park his truck and ring his bell, or he'd yell, potatoes, tomatoes, and the housewives would come out, and they'd gather around his truck and buy their fresh produce. My grandfather, on my father's side, he had a grocery store over near Baxter Street School on Baxter and Diamond in Grand Rapids. And Grandma DeVos in there would sell the penny candy to the kids from Baxter Christian School who would have a penny. And during the Depression, they sold enough candy to keep their store open. They lived in the back of the store, and they had bedrooms above the store. And so when somebody would come through the door, bell would ring, and if they were praying at the time, Grandpa DeVos, oh Lord, thank you for this. And he'd just scream out, just a minute, and then he'd go right on praying. And so that was how we grew up.